Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's our pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton, a
Greetings.
man of many virtues, many abilities,
And many vices.
Which you keep well hidden. I hope you'll keep it that way. We often start with some kind of clever remark on your part. And if the well is dry, I think our viewers will understand that. But if not, you could tell us something before them.
Well, speaking of wells, beer gives you strength. Wine gives you wisdom. And water gives you bacteria.
Okay. All right. On that note, I think alcohol has many good qualities attached to it.
Well, as Benjamin Franklin once said, beer is a sign that God loves us and wants us to be happy.
Yes. Well, okay. All right.
Two for one.
Two witnesses. Well, our last show, we talked a little, we sort of went over some of the economic issues that the country confronts in this economic cycle. And I think one of the things going on is that the word Marxist is reappearing in American dialogue, and it's the old Karl Marx and Engels and the Labor Theory of Value, all these tremendous books, the whole Soviet story, the communist story, Marxian viewpoint, and I think that President Trump is casting that, I guess, title on candidate Harris and say, well, you're a Marxist. And the subject has been sort of under wraps for a long time, but certainly that was part of the American political fabric. Many people, even in the Wild West, were Marxists back in Anaconda copper world. I mean, people, workers of the world. I mean, there are all kinds of times in our country where the Marxian ideas were out there, and certainly the excesses of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe, and it certainly is, to put it mildly, not in favor. I mean, most people would not like that title attached to them. But what exactly is a Marxist, and is Vice President Harris a Marxist?
Well, asking that question is sort of like asking of not similar, but a different religion, Christianity. What is a Christian? Well, it depends on if you ask an Eastern Orthodox or a traditional Catholic or a progressive Catholic or an evangelical. You're going to get a vast number of answers. There are so many different branches of Marxism. I mean, McGeorge Bundy, who is, of course, National Security Advisor, first to Kennedy and then for a while to Johnson, really came to prominence in the academic community when he did his senior thesis at Harvard on, I think it was entitled, "Was Lenin a Marxist?" I'm not even sure how Bundy answered that question, but
Well, he had the new economic theory, so
yeah,
Lenin certainly passed through a period when he was more practical. He had to save the Soviet state.
But yes, that he's certainly not a pure Marxist, as Marx himself would have understood the word. But the way I like to describe it to my students is, imagine that you're being forced to sit at a table and play a game of poker, but the rules have been devised entirely by your opponent. And your opponent is forcing you to play. Under those rules, you cannot win, and you are not allowed to get up and leave the table. So at some point, human nature is going to compel you to stand up, flip over the table, and pull a gun. That would probably be the defining characteristic of Marxist socialism as opposed to what we might call democratic socialism. The idea of not just the revolution of the masses, but the inevitable historically ordained revolution of the masses, who would then establish the dictatorship of the proletariat that will lead us into the broad sunlit uplands that that you and Churchill both love to describe. That's one of Churchill's best phrases, I think. So.
Oh, really? Well.
Yes. So. So I would say that that's classical Marxism in a nutshell.
Well, it's a philosophical idea, philosophical system, putting into reality the severe Marxism, you could say communism, you could use a word like that, an extreme system. And using the word extreme in America is quite pejorative, isn't it?
I think so, yes.
However, I think it's appropriate in describing that type of economic system. And the virtues or good things come from it, and a great number of bad things come from it. And the transition to any kind of such system is, I would say, fairly impractical, and for many reasons. And one of them is that underpinning the whole Marxian viewpoint is that people are just going to routinely work for other people, and if their back hurts, they'll work as long as they can, and then they'll say, "My back hurts too much to work. Can you please give me some money?" And their working colleagues would say, "Of course." Humans being what they are, they would just gradually do this, but they're not that way, are they? And so human nature, to me, means this the system is just not a practical idea. And where it exists, it's kind of an animal farm kind of situation where the people that control the media, that control information, and the indoctrination of the masses, to use a good Marxian word, they can sort of manipulate the masses and have a very nice life as they do it, and just as a sort of a pseudo-capitalist might, they're abusing everyone else. So I just think going down that road for extreme issues is not going to work. It's going to be hard to get there. And on the other hand, certainly in the left wing of the Democratic Party now, the phrase democratic socialist is there. You could say a fellow traveler, to use a phrase from the 1950s for an arch Marxist, would be a democratic socialist, and they would be part of the Popular Front. If we want to call the Democratic Party the equivalent of the Popular Front in Spain in the 1930s, where all the leftist parties coalesced under one banner to go against the fascists, the people they consider to be fascist or on the right. That's sort of what happened. It happened in France recently. And so saying that are the American people able to understand what that means to be a democratic socialist? And the fact the Democratic Party, in many ways, it's a broad tent, but the people that are flying the airplane, I think, are inclined to be democratic socialists. And what exactly does that mean? I asked earlier about communists. I'll now ask you about democratic socialism.
I think that Marxism is, of course, a brand of socialism. The idea of collective ownership of the means of production. I think the difference between a Marxist style of socialism and a democratic style of socialism is that use of violence to overthrow the existing order, and I think of that as legal order or economic order, and to establish a new order with a different rule book. And you actually give Marx more credit than I do. You say that a few good things come of it and many bad things. I'd be hard pressed to see what good things have, in the aggregate, come out of any so-called Marxist system. But I give.
Oh, you could say better. The education is better. We have equality. There's always
you can say that, but I'm not sure.
I think it's fair. There's some You could say, well, everyone is being vaccinated now. The state is so powerful; it's forcing vaccinations upon people.
Yes,
Whatever.
but,
I mean,
but
you
the
could
quality of the vaccination. Yeah, but those are
I
practical
mean,
issues.
there are some. I think it's certainly possible to extract some good points from almost any system, and
Well,
I'll give
perhaps, but I will give Marx the credit that when he and Engels were writing, the plight of the working individual was perhaps as bad as it has ever been, and that colored their thinking, and that they didn't really foresee a time when the electorate as a whole would start to willingly embrace more collectivist concepts, which is what happened in this country during the New Deal to a degree. And so I would say that our lived experience, based on how human beings actually work, has been much less workers of the world unite, you have nothing to fear but nothing to lose but your chains. It hasn't been that. It's been much more, to drift into science fiction for a minute, which I know we've talked about before, it's been much more Fahrenheit 451, that you get a world, as between 1984 and Fahrenheit 451, I think the latter is a much more accurate portrayal of how we live today. Where firemen exists not to put out fires, but to start them whenever they find books, to burn the books. But near the end of the book, not to spoil it, which I'm actually doing, the protagonist asks an old man, how did we come to this? Why did the government start doing this to society? And the old man says, you have it reversed. Government didn't do it to society. Society told the government to be that way. This came about by the will of the people. It wasn't forced, it was democratic. And so that is how, we certainly don't have a socialist system yet, except to a small degree, but we seem to be moving in that direction. I'll ask you a question. Do you own your house?
Yes. No, it's in my wife's name. My wife owns my
Okay,
house.
she owns, all right, she owns the house.
Yes.
And if she stops paying taxes on that house,
Right.
what happens to the house?
I assume the state possesses it.
So do you truly own it? What does ownership really mean?
Well, that's great.
It's not unconditional, it's not absolute.
No, well, all right. So, I mean, to me, there are two great lodestars in the sky. You could say government and property.
Yes.
And so in general, the government trumps property.
Yes.
And if you go back to actually the way the king, in medieval Europe, the king sort of received the kingdom from God, and then he passed out hunks of it to his supporters, and they had obligations to him, and then this went down the food chain to the peasants, and they were all interconnected. But there's still the overreaching power of the government to manipulate property is there, and so you could say that in a way, and we have many subjects to get into. We could go into the wealth tax. So in a way, real estate taxes are a form of wealth tax. Interestingly enough, the stock market doesn't routinely have such a tax, but there is a, quote, wealth tax there. But in general, the government, if you could say this in the capitalist system, they sort of trick people into trying to obtain capital. And it has obvious advantages, but in the end, they still run the show, and they can take the capital away as they wish and do, as I mentioned earlier on the death taxes, the tax arrangements. So the idea is that you want, at least that's the system, is that everyone can have sort of a free-for-all and try and climb life's greasy pole to obtain, I don't know, a big car or whatever people want. And doing that, there'll be a great societal benefit will take place. And so everyone will benefit from the process.
Yes.
And in the end, the government is the watchdog for the whole situation. And if someone is not playing fair as they try and climb the greasy pole, they can stop it.
Well, theoretically.
And if somebody's getting pounded too much below, they presumably do something about it.
And again, theoretically, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Well,
So, yeah.
I think it's fair to say that. But, and so, just to probe the issue a little bit, to me, the defining, we asked the question, what's a Marxist, and indeed, what's a communist? Well, it's the role that private property would play. And so I think even in a really severe Marxist world, a communist world, you can probably own your own shoes, or you can have your own dog or whatever. Your own shirt would be your shirt. Small amounts of property could be yours, and you could even give them to your descendants. But it is a very limited situation, and the state is going to control and own, if you want to say it that way, AKA the people, really the commissars, are going to own everything. They'll control the whole deal, and you'll get a bowl of soup, if you wish, as will your descendants, but you won't have a role in the means of production. And then so gradually going, that system generally is terrible as far as its outcome. It has, if the system is control, we have to control everyone. We can't. Everyone has got to be watched carefully. They can't do it. That lends itself to tyrannical control.
Yeah, and I think
yes.
the weakness is that Marx just completely ignores the natural tendency that a commissar would have to skim off the top for his own comfort, which, of course, we've been genetically programmed to do for, 2 million years of evolution.
And indeed for their children, their
Yes.
descendants. And so a question to ask, I've visited Cuba and I've asked this question, what's going on with the commissars' children? What's happening? What is their deal like? And I didn't really get any answers. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know what their deal is like, but the assumption is they're being well looked after.
So you didn't get a party line, or that your
Well,
sources just hadn't considered it, or they?
They nodded, everything there's fine.
Of course,
It was just a dismissive response.
Yes, of course.
But so just going through this gradation of the state and private property, probably the democratic socialists, it depends, and their system changes year by year, day by day. The state is really powerful, and it's very hard to do anything against the state's power. So the real thing is aggregation of state power, and they allow a little something, a few shekels to trickle out, and it depends on how much they do or don't do, but the power of the states is pretty extraordinary, and I think one example of that is in England, where the Labour Party Britain, shall I say, has taken over, and they don't like the idea of their private schools, so they've changed the tax system around. So anyone that wanted to send their children to a private school, and many of them are ancient and famous and of great repute. Well, I just can't afford it. You're going to have to go to a state school, and the government does things like that. It puts control, and a lot of it is trying to do something about the class system that economic circumstances create. And so we talked about the commissars and their children. Certainly the capitalists are even less. They're certainly out there.
Yes.
So you create haves and have-nots, and if the system becomes too extreme, we have a revolution.
Yes. Well, to back way up for a minute, to go back to the ownership of your house, I hope the point that I've made is that it's not black and white, it's not two columns, it's a question of degree.
That's my point as well.
Yeah, as long as you've got a community in which you live, there is no such thing as absolute ownership really of any property. And so the question is, how far down that road do we go before we get to the point that we could justly call it socialism? And I think anybody who has any understanding of American history knows that since the 1930s we have progressed at least some way down that road. Are we planning to go down that road farther? At what degree would it become socialism? Would that be a good thing? Would that be a bad thing?
Well, I think the real determinant of this is political process, and the people that would get some advantage on socialist system would support it economically, and the politicians that attempt, and they're not all evil, manipulative people. Many people say, well, I've seen the suffering of people that work in fields or factories, and I want to help them, and that's a worthy ambition. And it can also sort of dovetail with ethical systems, with Christian socialism. They're Christians. In fact, that's the way the parties are called, Christian socialists in Western Europe,
Germany.
many of them. But the real question is balance. And I also think another big word is control and motivation, and also social stability. So all those things are necessary. And as the world changes, the equations necessary to preserve those qualities become more, they're shakier. And so I think we're looking for a mechanism to protect our species with politics, with control, with property, and recognizing that in the middle of all this story, the humans have a very wicked nature, and it would be very easy to quarrel over possession of the water hole or I don't know, the fatted calf, and people are inclined to do that. And the role of government, I think, is to prevent that. On my guest house, one of my friends was in Rwanda. He took some pictures, and there's a canoe with people in, maybe 20 people in the canoe with people with armed guns. And they're taking these people out to execute them. And when something like that happens, it's a failure of the government, it's a failure of the system, and indeed, in our country, of the American people. I mean, to me, I'm astounded at the system we have, the situation we have now. How do we get to this situation where we have two candidates that are just loaded with every kind of, in my opinion, flaws, all kinds of flaws, all kinds of difficulties, and the societal tension is high. Everybody needs to say, let's try and work together and come up with an appropriate plan as best we can. And I think it's interesting, to discuss communism and Marxism. It's time to have that discussion. So beneath the surface, when the Berlin Wall fell and when the Soviet Union cracked up, there were millions of communists or card-carrying communists in the world, and now they all just disappeared. Do all the really liberal circles that might have been in New York City, they were a member of the American Communist Party, or who was the president that what's his name?
Yes, yeah.
Dobbs. Debs. Yeah.
Eugene V.
So
Debs.
he had a lot of votes. I mean, it's
yes.
part of the fabric of America. Well, now, bingo, nobody exists anymore. And yet they're there. And
I like to half-jokingly say that the only true Marxists left in America are on college faculties.
Ha 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 ha. That's true.
And it's only half-joking. So,
I know.
yeah.
I know. It's only a half joke, and it would be normal for people that are not part of the capitalist system, so to speak. I mean, they're not. They get their stipend. They live. They drink beer.
Stipend is a good way of putting it. That the big research universities, in some ways, are they're quite comfortable appointments, and so you can afford the luxury of theorizing that Marxism is a better way and a good way, and ignore the lived experience. So.
And you have tenure. That makes it.
Although I will say that in many places, Georgia included, tenure is being eroded, and some people are saying, well, that's great. I don't have tenure. Why should other people? Well, you pay a price for that tenure. You do pay a price in terms of, I'd say mainly money. I think it interesting that a lot of law professors who are, compared to undergraduate professors, are extremely well paid.
Yes.
That yet they would they would be making, most of them, far more if they were still practicing law. But it's my own personal theory that that they are willing to take that pay hit because they find the law practice so unpleasant. But so you do pay a price for it. Now, it's a price that would stagger a lot of people who don't have those perks. But it's still a price one pays.
Well, Bucky, do we have more time here, or are we near our
Well,
end?
we've got to start thinking about wrapping up. But yeah, it's interesting. I'd say that my last remark on this subject is that that as the population grows, the competition for resources becomes worse, and then the possibility and the appeal of radical, or as you like to say, extreme economic or political theories, these things become more attractive and lead us to greater dangers. I think and this is probably for another episode, I think radical population control may be a possibility that we want to concern ourselves with.
You know, we can
So
consider, right, my last comment, yes, Sendero Luminoso in Peru. So with the very difficult economic circumstance, and so sort of a cult arose to punish the capitalists, violently did so. And that's important to make sure that we don't get to that extreme point.
Yes.
And it would be easy to see it happen,
Yes.
would it not?
Well, let's hope that the better angels of our nature will somehow prevail, but they won't do it without serious discussion.
Well, once again, thank you for being here, Buck.
Thank you, sir.
Go forth and think great thoughts.
Right up.